For the talks that are about to begin. So welcome to PuppetCamp 2010 in Europe. Hopefully there'll be more than one of them somewhere else in the world. I wanted to thank you guys for coming out. I was at the, how many of you were at the PuppetCamp in San Francisco last year? Okay, all right. So this is pretty good because one of the things we were expecting is, how different of an audience is this going to be, which is, it's a pretty good sign. So hopefully now we can serve you guys a little bit better by actually being here. So for people like Bryce, who actually went to both, thank you very much for coming to both. The San Francisco one is good, but hopefully now we'll get a decidedly European perspective on Puppet and system administration. I don't know what that means. Hopefully it'll be more svelte, skinny people that are dressed better, giving us opinions on system administration. Not to disparage the American system administrators or how they dress, but you know what I mean. So I'm pretty excited about the my name is Deepak. Last name is really long. It's with a G and 13 letters after it, but you probably don't need to know it because I'm possibly the only minority I can see in the entire audience. So there you go. I'm going to have trouble at the airport, I think, probably leaving. So the good news is there's a good variety of talks, I think, that's going to be scheduled for today and tomorrow. So I think whether you are only now just getting started with Puppet or if you have an existing deployment, large or small, I think there's going to be a decent variety of speakers here that could answer questions that you're going to have. In the afternoons, we're going to be doing an open spaces format, which essentially means that a lot of the content for what is discussed during those time periods will largely be dictated by the audience. So we hope that it'll be kind of a collaborative effort. So as the talks are going on, if you can think of topics that you think deserve longer discussion or something that's more in-depth, keep those in mind so when we actually break up into groups, you'll have an opportunity to bring up all that stuff. There are also going to be, obviously there are a number of people from Puppet Labs proper here. So if you have any burning questions about, Puppet the product or, support or just how things are supposed to work, or if you just always wanted to talk to some of the developers, maybe not Luke, but someone that knows what they do, I think, then this is probably the place to go. And, during any of the talks, please feel free to ask questions. Hopefully we're trying to make this as collaborative as possible. So, I don't want anybody to walk away not feeling as though they didn't have the opportunity to get any of their, burning questions or concerns answered. So we should definitely try and stop people, and hopefully the speaker will have a chance to answer your questions. The other people that I would really like to thank are the sponsors. Optiver, thank you for being here. They have t-shirts and putty downstairs, which is pretty nice, unless you're trying to go home on an airplane, in which case they may or may not confiscate it. Apparently we had a small debate about whether they would confiscate it or not. I personally have had gummy worms confiscated for me, despite my insistence that gummy is not a liquid, nor is it a solid. It's a state of matter occupying a unique niche of deliciousness that science has not yet wrangled, but yeah, the security people were not impressed with my scientific theories about these things. So at least play with the gummy, and I think it may be non-toxic, so if you get hungry, you can eat it.
Maybe non-toxic?
Maybe.
We'll find out.
Puppet Labs bears no responsibility, no warranties expressed or implied in eating the putty. I'd also like to thank Bytecode. Bytecode here. Yeah. There he is. Open Future. All right. Back there and over here. Inuits. All right, there we go. TomTom? All right. Who used the TomTom device to navigate here? All right. I didn't use a TomTom device. I used a French device named Bryce. Who had a map.
Much more complicated and expensive.
Yeah, the user interface takes some getting used to, but latency is very good. And Canonical. I don't know if anyone from Canonical is actually locally here, but I would like to thank them anyway. Would you? It's very nice. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention before Luke gets up to give his talk is that a little bit about me. I guess I was I've been working with Luke for a couple of years, and I don't know how early of an adopter I was of the technology. Probably not super early. But the one point I wanted to drive home is that I think several years ago, it was the case, I don't know if this is a similar experience to a lot of you from several years ago, but within my organization or businesses that I worked at, the idea that you could automate a lot of these processes, the idea that you could develop something, something smart, something you could code up to manage your infrastructure for you, was something that I had to sell. I had to convince people that that was a good idea in many places, which was kind of odd. A lot of people didn't see the value. But now, if you fast forward a couple of years, I think things have changed considerably, where I no longer run into that particular roadblock. People seem to be ready to accept that this is a smart way of doing things. This is a new way. This is, the right way that people should be doing things. So, I'm excited that I feel that we're sort of at a useful point in history where hopefully we can change a lot of things. Or, I think hopefully in the talks that you guys see today, you'll be seeing a lot of different directions people have been taking the tools, which I think will hopefully open up your minds to what the possibilities are, to what can be done. So without further ado, Luke.
Thank you, Deepak. It gets funnier as the week goes on. So, you'll have to forgive me, I might technically still be asleep, so if I fall or do something embarrassing, hopefully I won't be entirely to blame. So as Deepak said, please ask questions. It makes it easier for me to know that I'm actually saying things you guys are interested in hearing as opposed to lumbering on about things that are not interesting. So I'm purportedly supposed to talk about portable infrastructure with Puppet, which is kind of what Puppet's all about anyway. But I wanted to go into the state of Puppet kind of as a takeoff on Larry Wall's State of the Onion addresses he always used to do for Perl. I don't know if he still does. One is that Puppet is very stable. We just put out the 25.5 release. The 25 release series is now very stable, and 24 before that was stable. So we've had a continuing run of stability. We obviously put out the 25 series had some unstable releases, but that's what that was the plan. To put out release early and release often, and so we've been doing that. But we've been successfully bringing all the releases to stability, and we're going to continue that with the next series releases too. But even with that stability, we're seeing a lot of changes. We're not resting on our world. We're not sitting there and not doing new things. So we're trying to add new functionality. We're changing things that exist in Puppet all the time. Am I blocking the screen too much? I don't have a whole lot of space to operate, but I'm trying to do this side there. I'm shorter than Deepak, so that might work better. So there is a lot changing, but we've got a pretty long track record of being able to make changes without being terribly disruptive. It's true that if you were to try to upgrade from a release that's 2 years apart, then you might have some issues. But we're gonna, our focus is always going to be on maintaining ease of upgrade from one release to the next, and over even a couple of releases. And Puppet is really everywhere by now. We meet companies every week, every month. We find another company who's managing 3,000 or 5,000 or 30,000 machines in Puppet. So it really is everywhere, and it's being used by almost everyone in all areas. We meet people who are managing 20 machines to 30,000 machines, and doing very simple, very boring, almost embarrassing things to holy crap awesome things with Puppet. So for those of you who were at PuppetCamp last year, fortunately it's just Bryce, so you can't prove any of this at all. But I made some promises last year, and I want to talk about how we've made progress, and it's not been quite a year, so it was September of last year that I was talking about these things. So Ralph is the release that we targeted at being 1.0, and Marcus can tell you that, because he's told me a bunch of times. So Marcus is in the back, and he's functionally the release maintainer and also the guy who does most of the work now. Maybe Jesse is the one who does the work, and Marcus does the releasing. I'm not entirely sure. But so one of the problems with Ralph, and one of the reasons it's taken a little bit longer to put out than normal, so it'll be almost a year between 25 and Ralph, is that we tied what we were going to put into Ralph, we tied what the goals for it were, which meant that we couldn't exactly tie when it's going to be released. So that's delayed the release a little bit as a result. But if we follow the current release concepts, then this would be called 0.26, but we didn't want to do that because we want to put out, I think it's long past time to put out a full version number release. It's stable enough, and I'm willing to make the promises that come with that. So theoretically, we call this 1.0, but 1.0 has a whole bunch of kind of implications with it that I'm not terribly happy with. So we decided we don't want to call 1.0 either. So what we've done is we're going to just multiply the whole thing by 10. And we're going to call it Ralph 2.6. And I'm perfectly happy after a couple of years to come up with some sort of justification as to how many releases we put out and how this totally qualifies as being a 2.6. But in the end, we just sat around and said, that sounds pretty cool. So that's what we're going to do. And I like it because it says, on the one hand, it's been stable for a long time. It's not like this is the first stable release ever. There's no 0 in it, so people aren't quite as afraid of it as they would be of the 1.0. Because everyone said, everyone knows not to use 1.0. Let's wait until 3.0. Well, look, we're so close to 3.0, you can use it today. So Ralph has a ton of stuff in it. It's got a huge amount of tickets fixed. If you look at the roadmap in Redmine, there are times where, as the developer, or as the person who stands near people who are the developers, it feels like there's not a lot of progress being made. And if you ever feel like that in the community, it's worth going through and looking at the roadmap and just seeing what's actually been done. Because maybe, if you don't see the release, it feels like there's no progress being made sometimes. But if you look at the roadmap, you'll see how many tickets are being closed and how much is really moving in the system. And it's a heck of a lot. So the percentages aren't as useful, but we've got 82 closed tickets. And that doesn't count the fact that we've put out, since 25, we've put out 5 point releases in the 0 to 25 series. And each of those point releases themselves had, between 50 and 100 tickets associated with them in most cases. So there's a huge amount of development going on. There's a lot of work getting done. I was looking through the commit logs last night as I was writing this at 4 in the morning. And just since March 1st, the number of commits that have gone into Ralph. And there's been a huge amount of development since we cut the release, but there's just a lot going on. So one of the things that is in Ralph is, I don't actually know if this is a feature or a bug, but you can do Puppet manifests in pure Ruby if you want. And this is first class, so you can take any place you can put a .pp file right now. You'll be able to put a .rb file. This is a very simplistic language so far. It doesn't have all the features. It doesn't have resource collection. I don't think it has. I think it has resource overrides. But this is a kind of a simple example of what it looks like. It's pure Ruby, and this does not execute directly. This, just like all the other manifests you use today, this compiles down to a catalog, which then gets sent to the client, or if you are running directly in the client, it still goes through the compile step. So it's not like you're just running Ruby scripts in your clients. You still have a lot of limitations on. It still has to go through the whole framework. So the most interesting thing for me about this isn't so much that you have a pure Ruby interface, it's that in order to enable this, we pulled a lot of things that were previously kind of hidden or buried in the implementation. We pulled those out and exposed those much more closely. So that's going to give us a lot more ability to extend what it means to be a resource class and extend what functionality is available and how you can get access to that. So you'll see that in some of the other features we've got too. So one of the first things that we did, once I had the ability to easily create and modify and manage classes in Ruby, I added class parameters. Once I'd done the work to do the Ruby interface, it was about 25 lines of code, probably exaggerating, I tend to do that, to add class parameters. So today in Ralph, you'll be able to add class parameters. And I know that there are still arguments as to whether classes and definitions should be unified, and probably they should. In this case, they're extremely similar now. Classes are still singletons. You can only have one Apache class. But this way, you can have configurable classes if you've got. And this is especially useful. This, I don't think, is quite as useful. But as you get the external node resources, as you get external node classifiers, then it becomes a lot more obvious how you want to do this externally configuring these classes. We've also finished the migration to REST. So 2.6 will still include all the XML RPC code, but our unofficial goal is to remove all the XML RPC code in the next feature release. So that means anybody running on 24 would not be compatible, 24 clients would no longer be compatible with the next feature release. To me, this is a feature, but it also means that we're still working on all the documentation for all the rest of the stuff, but it means that basically it'll be much easier to write other applications to interact with every aspect of Puppet, which is obviously a good thing, and that's one of our big goals. There hasn't been a huge amount of discussion of this on the various lists, but we're copying the Git world in switching to a single executable style. It's full backward compatible. All the executables that exist in 25 will be there in 2.6, but we have extended the single Puppet executable so that all of the existing functionality is available via just that one executable. And it's done in a way that's very easy to extend. So if you have a Puppet dash something tool, just like Git, you can, I have a simple Git command in my personal bin directory, git publish dash branch, and you can do, Puppet space that tool. So it's very easy to write your own extensions in, whatever language you want, treat them like a Puppet executable, and then because it's all using simple application classes in Puppet, it's easy to write actual pure Ruby Puppet executables too. So the nice thing is, as we add functionality to the system, as we add some of the things you're going to see later, you're not going to install Puppet and find 78 executables installed in your bin directory, which is obviously important. I have no idea what's up with the syntax highlighting on this file, but we have much more informative reports. We have extremely granular reports now. Previously, our reports included a bunch of metrics and then a bunch of log messages. And the log messages were pretty much just flat strings with a small amount of metadata. Well, now we've extended that to be extremely granular. Now you know a given parameter on a given resource was attempted to change from one value to another value with this result resulting in that message. And a given resource, you have the overall status of that resource. There's a lot of information. When you want to tie a change to a resource or to a configuration or something like that, it becomes much easier to do this kind of correlation because we've got extremely granular information now. Once 2.6 is out the door, the dashboard, I don't know if it'll ship on the same day, but our goal is to have the dashboard very quickly using this much more granular information. As I mentioned, because we pulled a lot of the internals out and exposed them for this internal Ruby API, we're able to do some other interesting things. So this is I think it's a very similar, it's almost the exact same Ruby class, or Puppet class we had earlier, but exposed as JSON. So taking all the important information in a class and extracting it as JSON so you can do things like, in the dashboard you could say, when somebody goes to add a class, it can tell you, okay, if you want to be the Apache class, you're going to need to set these parameters. And over time we'll add a lot of other functionality like what platforms that works on, or what operating system it works on, or whether it's incompatible with this class or that class, things like that. But this will soon be in the dashboard, so you can actually, and we've got some proof of concept code that already does this, but by the time 2.6 comes out, I think it'll be in the dashboard. So that'll give you a lot of, when you're, let's say, junior sysadmins go to associate a class with a host, the dashboard will automatically say, to do that, you have to fill in this information. So it'll be, automatic pop-ups of fields you have to fill out in order for that to work. There are a lot of performance improvements. Most of them are in very small areas, but can have very large impacts. There are things like Peter Meyer found an area where it could take up to some number of seconds, 30 seconds sometimes in extreme cases, to clean up after a transaction run. And removing that code mattered in 24, but doesn't matter anymore. So removing that was a potentially large improvement in a very small amount of work. And there are a bunch of smaller areas that we've been able to make slight refactors had a huge impact on performance. And one of the things that obviously Puppet can never be as performant as it should be, but there are a bunch of areas where Puppet still needs to be faster, it still needs to be less resource consumptive and things like that. It's always been surprising to me how many people we get who say, I would like this to be better, but I won't help you make it better. We do everything we can to work with people who find problems, who are willing to help test things with us. So one of the performance improvements I had here, I realized something that I thought was causing a lot of slowness on the compiler. I asked Paul Lathrop of Dig to comment a line of code out and test compiling, because his compiles were taking a long time. And because he was able to test this, and it took me 2 weeks to find somebody who was even willing to test this at all, who had slow compiles, he got a 70% performance improvement in commenting this one-line code. Broke some aspects of functionality, but when I imported that, when I did a refactor that did the equivalent of that comment but kept the functionality, we're seeing pretty drastic performance improvements. And so but I needed his help to test it. So, Marcus, you had a question?
Yeah, is it true that we're only going to let him have that fixed, or do people who didn't help also get
So the question was, does only Paul get the fix? So we do have a little case statement in there that says, unless your domain is dig.com or PuppetLabs.com. And if you can find that code in the system, you can just comment it out. But then you have to get up into the code, and now you're in trouble. So this is one of my favorites, partially because this is both a favorite and embarrassing. I have had this ticket open for more than 3 years. For a long time, I've known that relationships needed to be a first-class concept in Puppet, and they've always been slightly, I've been abusing the concept of a parameter to get relationships to work, because relationships are a thing that stand alone and have 2 endpoints. But in Puppet, you always have to specify them as this resource has a relationship to another resource, even though it's actually not really a characteristic of either one resource. So in talking to Jesse Wolf, who is annoyingly quiet all the time, I was talking about this and he goes, oh, well, why don't you just do this? And it ended up being entirely successful. So the way the relationships work is mostly it's just this little arrow thing. And you can do with a flat line, you can get the normal require style relationship or require / before. With a tilde and an arrow, you get the subscribe/notify behavior. And the cool thing is, you can have either a full resource specification. These notifies are, in case you're wondering how to test Puppet manifests, this style of notify is the most minimal way you can write a manifest to test something. So it'll show your output and be a full resource and be very simple and minimal. So if you're just testing syntax and function and structure, this is a great way to do it. You can also specify just the resource references rather than a full resource. So if you've got the resources specified in one place and you want to specify the relationship somewhere else, you can do that. And then you can do resource collections that will, so in this case you've got resources that specify log levels, and you can say all notifies with this log level come before all notifies with that log level, and that works. So 2.6 will have the ability to do many-to-many relationships relatively easily. Of course, this is also because it means you can make loops in your configurations much more easily than you could before. So with great power comes a lot of confusion. We also have hashes, which, as with almost all of the interesting things that happen in the language, Bryce did. I found last night that I thought this would work, but it actually doesn't. So this is very similar to how it should work, but I think in master it might slightly be broken, so don't test this in the master branch today, maybe tomorrow. But this is mostly useful right now for filling out information templates and things like that. This also taught us a lot about how not to release. So there are only so many things you can fix before you have a relatively infinite timeline on your release cycles. And one of the things that we will be doing after this release is out is approaching to the community, what is the right way to do this? There are a lot of risks when setting a release policy. Especially, we previously have tried to always maintain a quarterly release cycle. And if you have a quarterly release cycle, so say you put feature releases out every quarter, but then you have bug fix releases, you can find yourself where you've got 3 stable feature release branches. Like we could have 2.6, 7, and 8. If we put out 2.6 next month and 2.7 in October and 2.8 in January, it's very reasonable we would still be expected to be putting out bug fix releases for 2.6 in February of next year, because the release is only 6 months old. So that's very dangerous. We don't want to find ourselves in that situation, but we also don't want to find ourselves only putting out feature releases every 6 months or every year, because that's not often enough. So we as a community need to find some way to go through this and figure out what the right answer is, what the right way to do this, so we can balance the needs of agility and speed with stability and long-term ability to upgrade. Because we also want to tell people, well, if you don't upgrade every quarter, then you're not going to upgrade, right? So upgrading from 1 feature release to 2 later feature releases is pretty reasonable, but if you're releasing every quarter, that's only 6 months. And we talk to people all the time who don't upgrade for maybe a year, sometimes even longer. So the next thing that I promised to talk about was what I called last year the web GUI, which we have imaginatively named Dashboard. as in the Puppet dashboard. And the dashboard was first released in, I believe, very late November, possibly the last day of November, which I guess for Europeans would be December. And since then it's grown, it still is a very simple product. So always, I've always maintained the goal of releasing a barely usable product. I want the first release of any product should be almost useless to anybody. It should be just useful enough that it'll convince you to try it, and you'll get some value out of it. Because if we do more than that, then I'm going to spend much time on things that I think are really important, and it turns out actually don't matter to anybody else. So the goal of Dashboard was to get something extremely minimal out, get some user feedback, get community support behind it, and then begin iterating on the things that really matter to people. We're starting to get some real adoption. Rain has said people are starting to yell at him on IRC, which is the best sign that people are using the product, which is great. So we have a lot of node classification. I think actually both of the screenshots I have are related to reporting. But it's a very simple interface for getting you a lot of information on what's going on in your network. Is everything green? Are you getting failed reports? Are you getting good, bad, ugly? One of the benefits of Dashboard, as opposed to some of the other tools out there, is, of course, Rain sits just down the hall from me, although we don't actually have halls in our offices. And as we iterate Puppet, it's going to be much easier for Rain to get, for us to get. And it's not, right now, Rain is mostly the Dashboard, but that's changing. We'll have many more Dashboard developers, so it's much easier for us to get the new functionality in Puppet releases into our Dashboard application very quickly. We also have so good reporting that says what all the status information, and there's a lot of sexy cool things around searching in dynamic collections of things, and we'll be adding a lot of functionality to this over time, but obviously it still is a very minimal application, and we're going to keep it minimal until people start being very opinionated about it. We do have a lot more things that we're adding to the dashboard. The node classification and reporting are very much the minimal functionality that needed to exist. I'm trying not to talk about things we're going to do in the future. I'm trying to focus on things we're doing now, because there is a lot that we have already done that we are doing right now. But there is a lot of cool stuff coming down the pipe that you'll see in just the next quarter or so. Before I get on to the next topic, though, I want to go back and cover some of the founding history of Puppet and why I decided to do this in the first place. I don't know how many of you guys listened to the Beastie Boys when you were young, but every time I see the phrase, let's go back, my next response is, how far are we going back? Way back. So, why does Puppet exist? What prompted me to write Puppet in the first place? And in many ways, what has made it easy for other people to adopt Puppet? What made it easy for people to say, yes, that's a good idea, and the implementation may suck, and the guy who wrote it may be kind of an asshole, but overall, very good. I was extremely embarrassed at the state of operations tools. I was a consultant at the time, and I just was going into shop after shop, and there was no consistency. There was no ability to take skills learned in one place and reuse them in another place, and there was just no one was doing anything new. Everyone was kind of using the same tools that had been the state of the art 5 or 10 years ago. And I was also afraid that if I stayed doing what I was doing, that I would be doing literally the same exact work 10 years later. I'd be still a systems consultant going in and writing proscripts for people 10 years later, and they would look very similar, and I would just be writing the same code I'd written a long time ago. And so, to me, what I saw was the main thing that had to be accomplished, that had to be fixed in the systems world, was we had to get to the point where we weren't all starting from scratch. We had to be able to get to the point where one sysadmin could rely on the code that some other sysadmin wrote. And I know that frightens you to no end, but I think it is possible to do. And the benefit of this is that when you can do that, in your infrastructure, in your organization, the vast majority of what you have to maintain is not special to you. It's not unique to your organization. Everyone's got Apache. It's highly unlikely that you have a unique operating system. It's true that some of you might. Google, they have their own little operating system, right? But Google's special. Most people do not have a unique operating system. And while you might have some unique applications, the vast majority of the applications that you have to maintain are not special to you. And it's silly that you have to spend all this effort writing code to automate the things that everyone else also has to automate. So if everyone else is already maintaining Apache, somebody else has already gone through the effort of automating Apache, it makes a lot of sense that you can just download their solution rather than having to write it all yourself. And previous solutions, the standard Perl and shell scripts, limited your ability to do this because they had so many assumptions and so little support for what it meant to be portable across organizations, operating systems, applications, people, decades, whatever. So it's really all about allowing you as the sysadmin, or you as a company, as an organization, to focus on the things that are special about you, and not to spend all this time on things that everyone else is also doing. So the fact that everyone starts from scratch has resulted in a lot of other problems. When I was a sysadmin still, which thankfully I'm not much anymore, but everyone had their own standards, everyone had their own ways of doing things, and they weren't. It's one thing to say, well, we have our own standards because we're a highly secure environment, or we have a lot of concerns about uptime, or we have these special concerns, and those result in different levels of standards. But in most cases, what I saw was standards were relatively arbitrary. We have our standards because this dude back in 1998 wrote a Word document that said these were our standards, and therefore those are our standards. And that was how a lot of the standards were built, and it seemed like that wasn't a very good idea. So the whole goal of it was to try to, what would it take to attempt to solve this problem? And portability to me always makes me think of the transition from assembly to C in the 60s and 70s. And I don't think of C as being a relatively high language, but relative to the languages before that, relative to writing assembly code, C is fantastically high level. And if you're writing Perl scripts and shell scripts and things like that, or the scripts that I was writing, I can tell you this, the massive amount of code that I wrote as a sysadmin in the late 90s and early 2000s was all assembly code. If you were to try to take that code and reuse it somewhere else, in almost all cases it would be completely useless, it would be throwaway code. And just to remind you, the assembly code that the people were writing back in the day, if you bought a new computer, not a new operating system, not a, if you just bought a new computer, you bought a computer from DEC one day and a computer from DEC the next day, unless it was the exact same model of computer, you wrote everything from scratch. Think about that and how it applies to your infrastructure. You get a new infrastructure today. So I talk to customers all the time. We're doing what amount to greenfield operations. One of my customers has just built a new data center. Two of my customers are just built new data centers and they're turning them all off. Greenfield, I think the OS is the same, but all the policies they're applying, all these things are all very different. It's the equivalent of a new computer in the 60s and 70s was. If they weren't using Puppet, they would be starting entirely from scratch. All their code would have to be written again. And that's extremely expensive and not very good. So the ultimate goal was to find was to enable code reuse and make it easy for sysadmins to rely on work that other sysadmins have done. And I think in large part we built a platform that can enable that. Is Puppet perfect? Heck no, it's not perfect. There's still a lot of things we need to do to make it easier to reuse Puppet code written by somebody else. But I think overall we have a platform that will reach that. And now what we need to do is start actually sharing this code. And there obviously are a lot of great people like Alessandro has published a lot of modules. David Schmidt, who my understanding is going to be here, has also published a lot of code. So we've got a number of people who published between tens and hundreds of Puppet modules. But again, they've all kind of had their own ad hoc standards because there hasn't been any forcing function to push standardization and to make it easy for any random Puppet user to use the other user's code. So today, hopefully it's actually up and running and working right now, we are announcing our Puppet Forge. And this is a place to share the modules that you've created. So if you've got modules that you think are portable and reusable enough that other people could take advantage of them, and are managing applications that you think other people are actually using. Not a lot of use in publishing modules to manage code that you wrote. But you can share these modules and let's see. Yeah, so in most cases, there are client-side tools that actually publish the modules better. If you want to do it on the website, you can. But there are client tools that you can go in and use in the module itself that actually make this much easier. Find modules that other people have created. You can see we've got the standard tag cloud. Well, theoretically you can see my guesses. You can't actually see it. But so we've gotten some of the people who are in the community publishing these modules to publish some examples. The module list right now is pretty small because it's been in a private beta for about a week. It's been a private alpha for about a week, now it's in a public beta. So that this qualifies as the point at which it becomes public beta, where obviously this is a minimum viable product, this is a very simple thing, and I can almost guarantee you, if you don't find problems, we haven't released early enough, I guess is what I would say. And then, like I said, there are client-side tools. So the Puppet module, you'll be able to use this in 2.6, you'll just say, Puppet space module, and it'll look just like any other Puppet executable. So you can see you can do all the various, almost all the operations you would do on the website you can do on the command line also. So if you never want to use the website, I think you don't actually have to. And this will automatically extract, right now it's just if you've got pure Ruby extensions like new resource types or providers or functions and things like that, it'll extract metadata about those things and publish those on the website. So if you're looking at somebody's module, you can see not just the name of the module, but actually like what functionality is in there. The JSON we saw earlier for resource classes and defined resource types, that JSON will also be extracted in a soon version of the module tools. So you'll be able to see not just the pure Ruby types, but actually all of the code in the system in a module, you'll be able to say what classes are in there, what defined resource types, all the Puppet code itself. You can see that on the website too. Like I said, this is very much an MVP. This is very simple. You can publish and download, and that's about it. We do have a bug tracker, which is also a standard Redmine. There's a issue tracker instance, and we are obviously hoping you guys will go in and say, well, I need this functionality, and I need that, and I love this, and I hate that, and you guys are all losers, and whatever it is, anything you want to say. But this is all about code reuse, right? This is all about making it so you don't have to write code that somebody else has already got written. If somebody else has already written code that does this for you, just download it. In science, this is one of my favorite sayings. My wife has a PhD in cancer biology that normally wouldn't occur a scientist. A couple of months in the laboratory can often save you a couple of hours in the library. Obviously, this isn't ideal. You could instead do some research instead of writing all yourself. So in programming, I think there's a perfect corollary to that. And 10 years ago, this was much harder, but these days, if somebody else has already written the code and published it, there's no excuse for you to go rewriting it yourself. If you can find it online, it makes a lot of sense. Reusing, finding a library and using that rather than writing it yourself makes a lot of sense, right? So my hope is that that is what the Puppet Forge enables, the module Forge enables, is you can just download that instead of having to do it yourself. Might not save you months, but hopefully in the end it will. And it's all about collaborating on existing code rather than starting from scratch. And obviously there are going to be lots of cases where there is some recent published code and man, that code is bad. And you don't want to use it. That's fine. Take what you've done, claim your stuff is better, but then publish it. Don't sit there and say, I can write code that's way better than this. Write code that's way better than that, and then sit on it. If you're going to write better code, publish it, prove it, stand up, build your reputation on how awesome your Puppet code is. This is also one of my goals for the systems world for a long time. If you're a sysadmin, let's say you're the best, the awesomest sysadmin in the world. You write the best infrastructure automation code in the universe. Is there a way for you to demonstrate this somehow, to build a reputation as the awesomest infrastructure developer? There isn't really. So one of my goals was also to enable people to build a reputation based on how, if you've got a collection of 50 or 100 modules on the Puppet Forge, and 15 of those are the most popular, most heavily used modules, you're not going to have trouble finding consulting work, to put it mildly. One of the things I also like about this is it becomes a bit of a forcing function in the Puppet world. There are a lot of things that people can abstractly say, oh, I'd like to know this, and I'd like to know that. It'd be nice to have more metadata about my classes, about my defined resource types, things like that. Am I out of time? No, I still got 30 minutes. With the module forge, there's a place to display all this information, right? It's not like, it'd be nice if there was some executable that could extract this and display it in some sort of readable format or something. Now there's a place where this data should be visible. There's a website that should be publishing this right now. And if Puppet doesn't publish that, doesn't extract this information and give it to you right away, that's annoying. That begins to look like a bug. So it becomes a forcing function that says, look, take all the stuff that we know, it's static information. Puppet can extract this very easily. Make it extract that and publish it so I know all these things. So it really drives further introspection. Things that we could do but aren't doing because there was no good driver, it really does that. And then it also says, what things right now, I as a human know this. I wrote this code and so I know it only works on Slayers. So I only have Slayers, or I only have Red Hat, so I know it only works on Red Hat. But when I go publish this, I need some way to tell the people who are going to download this, look, this only works on Red Hat. Don't try it on Slayers. I need some way to tell them that, and I can document that, but that's kind of crappy. So you want some way to say things like, I, the developer, know this is the case. Make sure it only gets used here. And then also, a community member could say, well, I tried this on Debian, and it actually works fantastic on Debian also. Or, hey, it works on Debian with this patch, or something like that. And one of the things you'll see relatively quickly, too, is using the dashboard to manage your collection of modules. Because we're going to have a lot of modules. There might be 50 Apache modules, right? Which Apache module are you going to use? You need some way in your environment to say, this is the one that I'm using, and this is the one that I want to track. Obviously, this brings package-like behavior to modules. It's something that, one of the reasons it took so long to do this was I've always fought the development of a new package manager. And we're still going to do everything we can to not build packages, to not build package-like functionality if we have, God forbid we have a Yum for Puppet management packages at some point. But I am very curious to see how long it takes someone to build a package provider for Puppet modules. I expect it won't be that long. And for me, this essentially fills out the Puppet portfolio. This is the third leg of what we always needed to have. We have the core platform, the functionality itself, the thing that does the work and delimits the things you can do with Puppet. We have the console that gives you the interface for what's going on in your world and what's happening. And then we have the interface for sharing and reusing code. To me, these are the three corners of what needs to exist in any of these platforms to make the whole thing successful. And so now it's not about adding new features or new applications. It's about iterating on each of these and growing the development teams around them, and obviously doing what we can to get more participation in all these areas. Last year I had, you can't see the picture at all because of the lights. Last year my girls were much younger, but now they're kids now instead of babies. So any questions? That would be no. Oh, there we go.
Well, there's one moment that I was wondering, like in your presentation, you was showing the goals for the Forge. It looked uncommonly similar to Maven to me. So can you comment on that? Of course, minus the complete release cycle that Maven has. Is it intentional or accidental?
The question, I'm going to try to repeat all the questions so that they get into the mic. I'm not being intentionally duplicative. The question is, how much overlap is there with Maven? And it seems like there's a lot. I think, I don't know Maven terribly well, but my understanding is that Maven is, the majority of Maven's functionality is around the build tools to take complicated sources of code and turn them into a final artifact that you can distribute. Puppet, and especially the Puppet Forge, the Puppet Forge itself is really just a relatively simple application for publishing and sharing things. So it's not about how you build that artifact, it's about how you distribute the artifact. So it's much more about distribution, and even then, it's not at all about how you distribute the artifact within your own production network, it's about how you share that to other people. So my understanding is, Maven is not all about publishing to the wider world, it's about building artifacts and, to a very limited extent, distributing it internally. And then in terms of the comparison of the build process, the build process for a Puppet module is not quite, but almost entirely making a tarball. So it's not about doing complicated builds, we don't compile things, we don't do anything like that. It's very much tar that stuff up. We do some data extraction, turn this into that, make JSON, make whatever. But it's a very simple process. But in the end, the basic concern is valid. There's going to be overlap between Puppet and tool and other the Forge and the client-side tools that resemble other packaging and building tools. And I don't think that's avoidable. We did a lot of research into what things can we reuse something? Can we copy somebody? Can we just not do it ourselves? And I think in the end, we began with, one of the reasons that today the Module Forge really just does use tarballs is that it meant that we didn't have to commit to anything. So if somebody else goes, look, guys, you're dumb. There's a really simple way to do this. Somebody else has already solved this problem. We can replace our stupid tarballs with a more sophisticated thing that uses somebody else's tooling. But my understanding is there isn't something else out there that is simple to use and provides just this kind of subset of behavior we're looking for. So if I'm wrong, though, I'd love to research.
No, it's all valid points. For me, it was like very, very indicative. The syntax of the command line is speaking English. That's for me.
There's a good chance that the person who came up with the commands was experienced in Maven and just duplicated them to the large extent. So.
There was some mention of scoping variable scoping changes coming up. Is that going to be in 2.6?
The question is if there are variable scoping changes. I believe that was one of the things we had to cut for 2.6 to come out. Marcus?
So there's basically the pre-work is being done, and we're going to try and get as much as we can to clean up the edge cases, but that's probably not fully going to be in 2.6. And the reason is we have a prototype working prior to hashes, prior to class parameters, and prior to some of the refactorings. That code didn't come across entirely cleanly, and the others are higher priority.
In other words, Bryce and I broke Marcus's code.
Yeah, but the key thing is you should not be counting on the order of evaluation to obtain your effect. If you're counting on the order of evaluation, you are doing it wrong, and at some point that will stop working. If you are not counting on the order of evaluation, then your code should continue to work exactly the way it does now. The only case is where you're saying, haha, I know this variable is not set at this point, and so I'm going to make use of some sneaky side effect to get my effect. If you're doing that, eventually that's not going to work, and you should stop.
Yeah, so in general, the way Puppet does the variable scoping is arbitrary and capricious enough that relying on that it looks more like hacking than a good idea. And so when we fix that, in most cases it'll just behave more correctly, and it'll go, now it intuitively does what I want, as opposed to confusing me in a way. So that's not quite ready yet, but it should be in the next release. Questions?
What is the underlying architecture of PuppetForge? Is it just a website?
Yeah, the PuppetForge is a Rails app, basically,
Yeah.
with a big directory of targets. Very simple.
When you got PuppetForge, were you removing any of the more specific Puppet types as the Nagios types to Puppet?
The question is if we'll begin kicking things out of Puppet core into the PuppetForge. Yes. I can't tell you exactly we'll be doing that with Nagios tomorrow, but it might be on Monday. So this, I'm very much looking forward to that. There are things like the number of bugs we have fixed on the SSH authorized keys resource type is fantastic and painful. I'd love to not be responsible for that type anymore. And there are also a lot of things like Nagios type needs to iterate at a completely different rate than the Puppet type. And this will enable people to iterate that as quickly or as slowly as they want. And if you want to make a bunch of changes and publish them all, then that all works great. Very excited about that. Any other questions? And this is, it is up right now, so you can go make an account and try it out and upload code and download code and file bugs and make fun of how I'm dressed and whatever. Mark does it.
Can you give us that URL again?
I can give you that URL again. It is forge.puppetlabs.com. Very complicated. There we go. And then, yeah. I think you can read that, right? All right. One last question.
Yeah, sorry. These changes you've been making to move away, or at least the how I understand, to move away from the DSL to a more Ruby-like. Did I misunderstand that? Or
So,
are you aiming to move away from the DSL towards a Ruby-based configuration?
we're being recorded here, so I have to try to be somewhat circumspect, which isn't a strong point of mine. In fact, it's almost my kryptonite. The question is, are we moving away from the DSL towards pure Ruby? My very strong answer is no. We're not moving away from the DSL. The pure Ruby interface and the DSL are first-class citizens. They are both equivalent. They both do exactly the same thing. They have the exact same backend. They use the exact same code in the backend. Not only are we not moving away from the external DSL, we're doubling down, if that phrase crosses the Atlantic successfully. It basically means, we put money on the table and said this is a good idea, and somebody said, I'm calling your bluff, and we put more money on the table. We're going to actually take portions of the Puppet language. We've got, this is again, Jesse Wolf, who, if we meet him in person, you'll be surprised that this is true because he will not talk to you at all. But he's driving this, and we're going to take subsets of the Puppet language, and we're going to actually announce as standards a couple of very, very limited subsets of the language in a way that we'll be announcing with parsers written in C or something similar. So the original goal of the DSL, one of the reasons why there's an external DSL, is I wanted to do things like replace the, every packaging system used today has a manifest format. Even if they don't call it that, they have a manifest file that has a format that in general, only that packaging system uses, right? So RPM has one, and devs have one, and usually it's it was built to support files, so it talks about all the things you care about files. And then there's some delimiter, and there's a bunch of shell scripts under there. And they try to write it so it doesn't look like shell scripts, but they're pretty much shell scripts. And most of those shell scripts are used to do things like specify services and users and the things that Puppet already knows how to do. So one of the goals of Puppet in the first place was to enable package managers to actually replace their manifest format with a simplified resource specification format. There's no way anyone's ever going to replace their manifest format with Ruby. It's just not going to happen, right? Part of it's because we don't want to rely on Ruby to do our RPM installation, but part of it's because that would just be insane. So what we want to do is make the Puppet manifest language, the Puppet DSL, actually more commonly used and easy to reuse and easy to import, easy to use as your manifest language in something else. And that's, that's one of those future things that you'll see that relatively quickly. But there are going to be a bunch of things around that that are going to show how we're pushing in the future to make Puppet look more like infrastructure, make it look more like it belongs at as part of your operating system, at the center of your configuration world. And even if you're not using Puppet itself, you can reuse the language to do interesting things. So, question?
So you've explained why the DSL is awesome as a mistake. Why do we have the Ruby DSL?
The question is why we have the Ruby DSL if the Puppet DSL is so awesome. There are two reasons. Only two because I'm on video. One of them is that the Puppet DSL was always meant to be a very limited language. And that limitation has some real features, especially when it comes to giving less skilled people or people who don't want to learn Ruby or people who only have simple problems. If you look at what kinds of development you do in the Puppet world, in many cases you have essentially a split where there's a smaller group of people in your organization who write most of the functionality. And then there's a larger group who essentially collect that functionality and just associate it in various ways. What I expect over time is that the people who write the more complicated stuff will end up doing it a little bit more often in pure Ruby, but the people who do the much more limited subset will stick to the Puppet DSL. So it enables the separation there. And another reason is because what I really liked about doing the Ruby DSL, and the biggest reason that I personally actually made it happen, as opposed to saying, yeah, we got it, because I wrote one in 2006. For the record, we've had a pure Ruby DSL since 2006 that was usable. As far as I can tell, 0 people ever even tried it. So I had every Ruby conference I ever went to, somebody said, well, why can't I use a pure Ruby interface? And I got so tired of this that I wrote one. And every time they asked me this, I go, it's there. Look, here's the wiki page. It tells you all about it. They would go, well, I'm not going to use that. So I didn't do it because I think people will use it. I think people will really use it, but that wasn't enough to drive me to do it. I did it because doing it forced all of this critical infrastructure, all this critical code that was hidden in the parser, that was hidden in Puppet's DSL. It pulled it all to the forefront, forced me to model it all much more directly in a way that a lot of the things that are in Ralph are actually directly derived from that benefit. So what it did is it forced you to treat some of those things as internal APIs that other things can use. So I really like that aspect of it. And the DSL portions, if you look at the commit series that resulted in the Ruby DSL, it's something like 40 commits. 3 of them are the Ruby DSL. The other 37 are all the infrastructure changes that needed to happen to make that work. So that's the biggest reason. And I think that there will be real benefit, and I think that some people will find they want to step to Ruby really quickly, they want to iterate, they want to do things that are way outside the bounds. But most sysadmins will actually still be very happy with Puppet DSL. So I think you'll see a separation, almost a speciation there. But my hope is connecting to external data will be a much better way to get functionality, get flexibility in the system rather than doing complicated code in Ruby.
Sorry,
Long question.
But so basically, you've made all of the kind of realm much more accessible to outside tools as well?
The question is if the RAL has become more accessible to outside tools. In general, I would say yes. I think there is an unfortunate separation between what it means to be a resource or a resource type on the compiler, and what it means to be a resource or resource type on the client or in the RAL. That separation will be, we've begun to fix that, but we're not there yet. When that separation is fully fixed, then the answer will be a wholehearted yes. Right now, it's mostly. That's obviously the goal. That goal is to take all those things, and frankly, that's part of the goal of the single executable thing, if I were to add, I think there are 4 or 5 executables I've got in my head that I'd like to add to interact with different portions of the Puppet subsystems, but you don't want me to add 5 executables to your packages, right? But if I can treat this all as sub-functionality within the Puppet itself, then I can begin to say things like, here's a little bit of the route you can interact with, here's a little bit of the catalog you can interact with. So we can start to do things like have a Puppet catalog executable or command that interacts with various pieces, right? So we're going to do a lot more of that now that we've got a lot more infrastructure and
I mean more than from other Ruby programs, for instance.
yeah, so
Or Puppet, user package file.
that will be, today that is not yet enabled, but that will be soon.
Yeah. I mean, you can do it, it's not fine.
Yeah, I will say that today to do that you have to do two method calls that you shouldn't have to do. But it still is drastically easier than it was in if you want to write a Ruby script that did work in Puppet in 25, it was a pain. And in 2.6, it is actually very simple. And I can tell you this because I've gone through a bunch of unit tests that I wrote that did work, and I modified them all. Mostly it looked like this. So it is drastically simpler. It's not anywhere near as simple as I want it to be, but it's drastically simpler. So yes. All right, and I'm out of time at my own conference. So please do track me down, ask me questions, tell me about the awesome things you're doing with Puppet, and tell me how much you hate it and what you'd like to see different, and then tell Marcus to do it. And yeah, and you can't all buy me a beer. I understand that's the international currency of open source, but I would be dead if you all bought me a beer. So buy one for Deepak instead. He gets funnier the drunker. So anyway, thank you.